Okay, so our next speaker has 18 years of experience in the industry. He's had lead positions on many AAA titles, including Halo Wars 2 and the Harry Potter series. He is, however, most known for being lead designer at the critically acclaimed cult hit Alien Isolation. So please welcome Gary Napper to the stage.
See ya. I also don't have a PC hooked up yet, so this may be a couple of minutes of awkward stage presence. Thank you. That's for free. It wasn't even rehearsed. I don't have another dance, so I hope they're kind of quick. Right. There we go. Right, in that case, I'll get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here in lovely, rainy, grey Bergen. Let's do it. I just want to thank everyone at Konsoll for having me back here. I was here a few years ago, and just to see how much it's grown has been absolutely amazing. It's just this really huge thing. So congratulations to all those on the success of that. And I also want to thank all the guys that sit at the back in the dark there and make it all happen, because they're like the metaphorical air traffic controllers of events like this. So just a round of applause for the guys at the back. Thank you. That also helps and ensures they don't mess with my mic or kill the volume. I'm kidding. So, first off, who am I? My name's Gary. I'm currently a game director at Supermassive Games in Guildford, known for the Until Dawn series and the up-and-coming Dark Pictures series. Before that, I was working at a VR studio for Sony in Manchester. I was design director at Creative Assembly. Before that, I worked at many different EA studios, such as EA Brightlight, Criterion, EA UK. I'm most known for being the lead designer on Alien Isolation, but I also worked on Halo Wars 2, Harry Potter, the Burnout series, Spare Parts, and a whole ton of other games. For those of you who are looking to get into the game industry, one thing I'd really like to make a point on here is for every game I have released, at least one or two other games I've worked on hasn't made it out. So hit rates, roughly 50% of the games I've worked on have made it today. So that's a lot of games that just have never seen the light of day. I'm here today to talk about VR. As Raf said this morning in his talk, the industry is moving really, really fast. VR is considered the wild frontier of game development at the moment because it's a new area that everyone's experimenting in and doing stuff in. Just a quick show of hands for me. Who's tried VR in the room? That's amazing. Okay, this is crazy. So, I wrote a similar talk to this about a year ago and asked the same question, and about maybe 5-10 people put their hands up. So, yeah, that's how quick it's moving. It's really good. We are working in largely the unknown a lot of times with VR. People are experimenting with VR, haven't used it before, they haven't had experience in kind of opticals or working in fully 3D interactive environments. And we see a lot of rules being written for how people should be doing this. But a lot of those rules are also being broken shortly after they have been written, and people are finding new ways to work around things and break things. It's a kind of exciting time to be in game development with this sort of tech, but at the same time, there's a lot of risks involved with it. I want to talk quickly about terminology here, because when you work in VR and you see a lot of talks in VR and conversations about it, there's a few phrases that are generally overused. One of them is immersion. It's an immersive experience, a deep mental involvement in something. And people tend to say, oh yeah, VR is so immersive, it's this immersive thing, immersion. But I always think, like, you could stick a black bag over your head and be immersed in darkness. So it's, it's not really doing a lot to explain it a lot of the time. And then you have this other options of presence, a sense of being there, this idea of being present in a room. It's a little more accurate, again, it gets overused quite a lot. But it's the whole reason this is happening and people are using this term presence is because what you're seeing, a lot of people are seeing for the first time, which is things being shown to you that you can look around and take in visual information. Your brain's telling you there's something there that isn't actually there. And that's a big part of why we are creating all these rules and having to work with it. So a few example rules here I find interesting. So I've heard a lot of people say, avoid camera motion. Don't do any camera motion whatsoever, because camera motion makes people feel ill. Don't accelerate or decelerate, because that can make you feel weird and it's not quite right in VR. You must have a frame of reference in the scene, so something to look at so that you're in a cockpit or there's something in front of you to know which direction you're facing. You need to have a body. You have to look down and see a body and see arms and make sure you're actually present in the world. You don't need to have a body. If you look down and see a body and it's different to yours, you get confused and it gets very strange. So audio must come from somewhere in the world. You can't hear audio in the game unless you can visibly see a speaker or a source it's coming from, which can also limit you hugely cinematically. So there's a lot of these different rules. And I've played games and created experiences that have broken every single one of those. So what I'm going to do is talk through a whole bunch of example rules and explain why I'm attacking it like this. Again, to Raf's point earlier, technology is moving hugely, hugely fast. And believe it or not, it's getting harder and harder to say this as I've been in the game industry for 18 years, but it's still quite a young industry. We're still not figuring out things and the way things should work, and we've got a lot of new things to play with. We have small teams working very, very different to large teams. You look at a lot of entertainment industries, and there's a similar sort of thing, where as the technology comes together and the people come together to interact with it and build based on it, they all create their own structures around that, and I still don't think there's a consistent set of rules set across everything. There's one of my favorite game designers, aside from Raf, just a little fan nod there, is a guy called Jesse Schell, who wrote this book called The Art of Game Design. And it's this fascinating approach of looking at your design through lots of different lenses to answer questions about your design. And one of the things he puts forward is that there's no periodic table for game design. We don't have a set of rules that says, this is how a platformer should work, this is how a first-person shooter should work, And his attempt at writing this book was to create one of those. Now, we want to do that for VR, but part of that is addressing another thing we add to this, which is the feeling of motion sickness. A lot of developers don't want to talk about it. Some are quite happy to. Some have published research on it. And this is something that we can't actually ignore as developers, because it has a huge effect on the idea of putting together a rule set of what's right and what's wrong, because it's so personal to individuals. We've discovered certain things like, people put on a headset and they go, oh, I feel motion sick, because they've heard a lot about motion sickness. And when they put on a headset and start to feel motion, they believe they feel sick. And again, it's the brain tricking you, because your brain's seeing movement, but your body's not feeling it. But the actual feeling of motion in a headset is not motion sickness. Motion sickness is a bad feeling that slowly builds and stays with you once you take the headset off. Feeling motion is something your brain's tricking you into doing. There's also a huge difference between things like pixel travel, where if you see lots of movement around the sides, or you strafe in a game, a lot of visual information is being passed to your brain that it's kind of difficult to process. So that can cause some ill feeling as well. One of my favorite, I shouldn't really say favorite, but one of the most curious things we deal with is something called exit syndrome, where you've been playing in VR for quite a while and you're having the time of your life. You take off the headset and your brain goes, whoa, detail, real world, and you actually feel weirder taking off the headset than putting it on. So there's all these wonderful, strange things that the body is reacting to with VR, and it's just a matter of designing for those things and finding the things that suit your game to go with it. Now, movement is the big one. This one is quite a big early rule for me, which is when VR started becoming more accessible and more available for everybody. You would see a lot of people would take a game in Unreal or Unity, they'd take a first-person shooter and they drop it straight in VR. And they just put the camera in it and they go, there you go, and everybody feels awful. Because there's so much you need to do to get an experience that's just regular movement first-person into something that's suitable for VR. It's one of the easiest mistakes to make early on, so I ensure everyone doesn't do that. Now, we talk about this being a young industry and, this is a brand new tech and it's the exciting edge of development, but VR has been in use for decades, like actual decades, longer than I've been in games. One of the people who's been playing with it for that time is a guy called Bei Yang, who works at Disney. He did an incredible talk at GDC a few years back where he explained about what Disney had learned about VR and the type of ways they experiment with it, because they've been using it for education and theme park rides and all sorts of things. And he said this thing that I thought was absolutely incredible, where he said he knows for a fact that what makes you feel sick in real life will also make you feel sick in VR. So that's an easy one to think about, because if you look at twin stick controls in Call of Duty and Battlefield, those games have things you can't do in real life. I mean, I hate to break it to you, but you can't jump 7 foot in the air, 360, no-scope someone and land without throwing up. I know if we can evolve to the point of doing that in real life, I'm not sure. But the actual feeling of that is something your physical body's not prepared for. And that's why I don't think we'll ever see a game like Battlefield or Call of Duty, that sort of gameplay in VR, because your body's not designed for it, and spinning around on the spot 180 to get that Twitch-based gaming experience is just really, really nearly impenetrable, really. There are solutions to this, and there's a lot of teams doing some really interesting stuff with movement, but again, we don't have an agreed method yet. If you go and play a bunch of first-person games in VR at the moment, you'll find an incredible amount of variation in the chosen design, the way you move. If you go back as far as I do, when analog sticks first came out, the few games used them in different ways. And it was like, okay, well, this one's move, and this one's look, and this one's strafe. And it was a few years before it actually became an acceptable method. Now you can pick up analog sticks, and you can go between Halo, Battlefield, Fortnite, any first person. You always know left sticks move, right sticks look, and it's just becoming the accepted norm. And we need to get to a stage with that where we've got that accepted norm with VR. But at the moment, we're nowhere near it. There's lots of demos and experiences available on Vive and Oculus, and you can download a lot. But the thing that really gets me about this is there's lots of bad ones too. Lots of people are doing a lot of experiments. And as VR is a very personal thing and you want to get people excited about it, the worst thing you can do is check out this crazy student demo. And someone puts on a headset and it's a really unpolished, very jagged edge experience, and it can really push people away from it. I would say to all people working in VR at the moment, anyone actually working in VR or planning to? There we go. There's a whole bunch of hands. Awesome. Get your movement feeling right before you build anything. Just get what sort of movement you want to have in your game, what sort of game you need to support that movement, and just figure out everything around your kind of movement basis first. Physical drain. Now, this is one that's been an issue for me since before working in VR. Years ago, I worked on a game called Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, that was it. And it supported iToy and Kinect and things like that. And one of the things it had was this mode where you were waving your arms around. So there was a big window in the front of one of the magic shops, and things were all clouding the glass, and you had to wave your hands and wave your hands. At the time, I was working with a test department at EA, and we had a team of 60 guys and girls who were like the elite players you would ever meet. They were like the SAS of testing, and they would take a game and they pull it apart in seconds, and they were incredible. I lost nearly the entire team to arm strain over 2 days. Because you get a bunch of people who are used to sitting like this for days on end with minimal bathroom breaks and playing World of Warcraft in their underpants for weeks, and you say, play this game where you do that. Even people who are incredibly physical and in the top condition, you ask them to wave their arms for 8 hours a day in a test situation. It's a lot. It's the same aspect of anyone can hold their arm out. But if you say, hold your arm out for a minute, or maybe 2 minutes, or 5 minutes, it becomes a huge factor. And that actually puts a massive limiting strain on the amount of time you spend playing the game. So if you're designing a game with motion controllers and movement, consider how long your player's going to be playing that game, and for how long you want them doing those physical movements. This also extends to how long you want to be in the headset. Depending on the type of headset you use and the sort of person you're around, your tolerance to it as well, you can have varying play times in VR. Sometimes you can sit in there for hours on end, sometimes it's 20 minutes at a time. Again, depends on the weight on the headset and the type of technology you're using. On average, there's the kind of estimate that it's about 20 to 30 minutes at a time is comfortable for most people. So that's something we tend to design around in gameplay chunks and building and peaks and troughs in your gameplay. But one of the things I made me chuckle was how long people are spending in headsets playing Elite Dangerous, where people are clocking up 10, 12 hours purely, and this guy's nodding, he knows what I'm talking about. People who just sit in the headset for hours on end. And there was an incredible story I read on the forum about a guy who really, really wanted to feel like he was actually in the spaceship, and he came up with this ingenious idea of starting the game, putting on the headset, and going to sleep. So when he woke up in the morning, he would be in a spaceship. And apparently he woke up first thing and just freaked out, like, and for a couple of seconds he was living that, and he knew he was in that spaceship, and then reality set in, and he was like, oh, I'm an idiot. But still, that's the kind of lengths people are going to enjoy VR at the moment. So designing for the restrictions and the advantages of the platform has always been an interesting thing. Things like Batman VR, Rush of Blood, Tumble VR, and Thumper, they all take completely different approaches to their rule sets and how they implement things for the player to use. Batman VR has both the options to play it while seated or play it while standing. Rush of Blood has completely guidance over the way the track's moving in front of you and everything balanced around where you're shooting, so it's a very natural experience to play while sitting. Tumble VR was a really, really simple game from Supermassive, which was evolved playing with physics objects and creating puzzles and stuff, and that was a great introduction to VR for a lot of people. And games like Thumper that are just completely surreal. You have nobody flying through the world on this crazy swinging track with a death metal album happening all around you. It's an incredible experience. But again, there's not a lot of motion sickness in that. One thing that we've got used to in video games over the years, especially in AAA, is this idea that visual fidelity gives you a bigger feeling of realism. So you create something, physically based rendering, incredible lighting, everything feeling right, you feel like the game is more real. That actually comes in quite a weird way into VR because you're so used to seeing what real life looks like that when you see something approximating it in VR, it can feel a little strange. We found that if you build a test room with just no textures in VR, just completely plastered walls or one shade or everything, and you just light it, the place will feel real. Because your eyes and your body are used to measuring distances, and I know how many steps it is to that place over there, so I understand the dimensions of the room and I can figure out my space within it. So building things at a lower res actually gives you a better feeling for the room. You can enhance the feeling of that by adding just basic lighting in some cases, and adding audio makes a huge difference to it because once you're in VR, even in this room, you hear my voice echoing around, and you can hear coughs and rustlings of paper. That's a lot of our brain taking in "I am somewhere real." If you took all that away, the place feels less real. So adding accurate audio and lighting is sometimes a bigger step to making something for me for real. Scale, atmosphere, and tone, if you work on that early with just basic visuals, you can reiterate it and get the space feeling more how you want it to and how you need it to suit your game. Early on as well, this was a big learning for me, especially at Sony, was frame rate being entirely key to the experience. Normally, I don't know if this is speaking bad of previous studios I've been at or not, but normally you throw everything into a game and you worry about the frame rate later. And you get a week before beta and the game's crawling along at 4 frames a second, but it's fine because all the art's in. And then the poor programmers have to go and optimize everything and scale everything down and get everything working better. In VR, as soon as you drop below a certain frame rate, the game starts to become unplayable because your frame rate is connected to how you move through the world, and when your body's not picking up the same information at the same rate, you start to feel motion sickness. So you get the situation where someone on the team very early on checks in an asset or changes something in the game, and then the whole team can't play in the game anymore without feeling ill. So it's really important to keep checking that frame rate and making sure that that's always at a sustained level no matter what you do. And that requires a lot of organization as a team to keep on top of that as you go. Framing and composition, this is a great one. This is one of my favorite topics in VR, really. If you think about traditional film, you've got framing. You can say, I want this character in the third, I want everything leaning to this area, I want to have a hero shot with somebody low up in the frame staring up at the big bad guy who's looking down on them like that, and you can frame it really nicely. In VR, you can't do that because you have no frame. I mean, aside from this stage I'm standing on, if I say to you, let me stand in the third, it's like, what? There is no third for me to stand in. What you've got is dead ahead and everything either side of me. So what we end up doing is looking at architecture and stage design to give you that framing. Much like, again, here I'm standing on a stage and you know where the third is because we've got this frame, that's actually framing me here. So you start to design your world in a way that's a lot closer to interactive theater stage design because the player can be anywhere. The other side of this is in video games, you can't take control of the camera in VR. You can't just stop the player and twist their neck back to see the piano in the corner anymore. They have to notice the piano to see it. So you have to design environments to draw the eye into the areas that you need. And again, a lot of that comes from original stage design and set design and things like that. So all of a sudden, your level designers and artists have to learn a lot more about framing an area specifically for drama. If you're making a game that's got a lot of narrative in it, you need to know the emotions you want to convey in those areas before you design the spaces for them. I'll go into a little more on that. So just a quick reference here. There's a couple of Twitter accounts I highly recommend following if any of this stuff interests you, which is @CompCam and @OnePerfectShot. There's some really interesting geometric slides and kind of looks at the way films frame things, and I think it's great. And again, this book here, 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School, is hands down one of the best books ever on level design, because it's all about designing spaces for humans to be in. And it's very basic note form, but it gives you, again, a much better, clearer idea of how to design spaces for humans to interact with. Pacing versus guarantee of information. So, like I said earlier, we can't click the player's head back and get them to stare at the piano, so we have to wait for them to stare at it. Now, it's easy in VR and in games to get the look direction from the player's camera and know roughly what they're looking at, so I can trigger a light depending on where I look. Now, I'm going to set up an example here. So you've designed all your architecture. So we've got this thing where the hero, she's standing there and she's all ready and she's like, right, I'm going to take on the world. And then this big evil villain is all set up to walk through this door. So all your eye lines work. You've got a big entrance area for the big villain to walk in, and the hero's standing in this position where the eye lines are different so that the villain coming in will seem big and dominated and the hero's in this weaker position. And you create the world, you create the scene, you set it all up, you build up the music, you set the lighting and everything, you play it, and the big evil character walks into the room, and your players look in that way. And what happens is they go, oh, hey, I didn't see you there. Now, that's not the strongest entrance for the big villain of your game, and it doesn't quite convey the same weight when someone walks in and nobody notices them. So one way to do that is to sacrifice the pacing of the scene for guaranteed delivery of information. So what I mean by that is the music swells up, the lights change, everything flickers, and the player's standing there, and they're looking around, and nothing will happen until they look at the door, and then it bursts open, because you can trigger in the events in the world based on where you look. Now, obviously, that gets a point where you wait a bit too long and it feels a bit dry, so you need to figure out where you can make these adjustments. And also, it depends on the type of game you're making. If it's not that narrative and it's not that heavily dramatic, you can just go with triggering things when people look. If the pacing's important to you, figure out when it's right to sacrifice that to convey the events that you want in the game. Personal space. VR brings out the issue of personal space in a very interesting way. I don't know if anyone's played the London Heist on PlayStation VR? Hands? Wow. Oh, there's a few people. Okay. So I'll explain it. There's a scene where you've been framed for this robbery, and there's this big evil London guy with a blowtorch sitting over you, and he flicks a cigarette at you, and he leans in and he goes, "You better tell me where the diamonds are." And you're like, ugh. And he's there. He leans right into you, and as a player, you lean back because somebody's invading your personal space. And that's not something we've really had to consider in designing video games before. Because if you're playing a first-person or third-person game and someone gets close to you, you kind of go, oh, you move them out of the way. But you don't feel the physical animal impulse that somebody's in my personal space. And if you're not designing with that in mind, and you bring a character right up to the player, you can have a really bad situation where someone's completely in your space and your player's like, I'm really not comfortable with this situation. So the idea of bringing characters very, very close to you in VR is something you have to really consider in the way you're designing your scenes and the way you're setting everything up. Eyes and characters is another part of this. So if you imagine, any RPG or any game over the last few years where a character gives you a mission brief. So the character's on screen and they're staring either straight at your character or straight at the camera, and they say, we have this mission where we have to fly to the other side of the galaxy and rescue the princess and destroy the evil Martians and blah, 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 blah. You're used to that as a character, and you're used to these NPCs delivering this dialogue and this story, and you go, okay, that's fine. As a player, you accept that. In VR, if I put an NPC in that comes and stands in front of you, and I stare you directly in the eye, and I say, we've got a mission on the other side of the galaxy, and you need to go there, and you need to get across there and rescue them and blow up the station and the Martian. You feel so awkward right now, because I'm just staring directly at you, and guess what? People don't just stare directly at people while they talk to each other. So when you do that in VR, naturally, players feel terrified, because you start to look away, and you're like, geez, why is this character staring at me? And it's again, it's something you discover when you build. Eye contact is a huge part of human interaction. You know, it indicates intimacy, it indicates threat. It's a behavior that we've learned all through our lives to deal with and react to. Performances we tend to put in games are movie powerful because they are actors, and they are acting like they would in a film. So if I came to you again, sorry to pick on you, sir, but in real life I came to you and go, all right, man, we're going to shoot across the other side of this universe and we're going to get us to that space station. You're like, chill, yeah, I get the mission. Like, you know, I need to talk to you like a human. So if you're designing a situation where characters are going to interact directly with the player, you have to design it and get your actors or your performance or your animators to craft something that feels a little more reserved than humans, because we pick up on body language, and body language is a huge part of that. Where the player is looking is another important thing. You can use that information to change a character's behavior. You know, if someone's looking at you and I stare directly at you, if my NPC reacts to that, all of a sudden as a player I'm aware of the situation I'm in a bit more, and you can play with that in some really interesting ways. Part of the idea of this movement and reaction of humans, again, is that again, the animal urge and the animal understanding of another creature being there and acting in a certain way. So, I was working on a game where you got in a vehicle, and every time you got in the vehicle and you looked to your left, this character who was in, crash test dummy, he wasn't textured, anything, he just had animation on him, and he'd look at me and he'd do that. And every day for 6 months, I just went, I nodded back, because people do. If people nod to you, you kind of react, and it's just natural. It's someone's physically acting, and you physically act back. So that can be a really powerful thing to use, and again, a very surprising thing to discover when it's just a crash test dummy as well. A huge thing that blew my mind was we played this demo where characters had gloves and a helmet, and you just walked around in the world and you could see other players doing the same. And the other players were just represented by, a head and arms. Now, if I made a game where my hands were just cubes and my head was another cube, and I gave it to a group of friends, so let's say you guys are all friends, we put you all in that virtual environment, without any voices, all of you could tell who everybody else is just from your body language. It's that thing where at a distance you notice someone because of how they walk. And you're like, oh yeah, there's Gary, that's Gary's walk. Again, people, we react to movement and feeling and the way people act, and we can tell who someone is before they've spoken. If someone's, Halloween, someone's dressed up, you roughly know someone who is through their body language. It's exactly the same. It's very minimal information, but as humans, we've trained through our lives to detect these things and know what they mean. So again, this makes it even more vital to concentrate in when you're doing your motion capture and your animation with any kind of human-to-human interaction in your video game. Now, this is a real tricky one for me for VR. Experiences differ greatly, and that's not just when it comes to comfort. So we all accept that everyone has a huge difference in the amount of intensity they can take when they play VR. Some people can go for ages, some people have to be still, some people can't deal with camera movement, some people are happy to sit there for hours and go on roller coasters and it doesn't affect them at all. And it's about figuring out roughly where your game's pitched and at what groups of people. But it's not just the comfort on this. This is the first time I've been in game development and I've built something that I go, this feels great. I know how this works. I'm used to going, yep, this feels great, it's brilliant, have a go. Someone else picks it up and they go, oh yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, that's very satisfying, I understand all that. But in VR, I keep having a situation where I design and build something, I go, this is great. And I hand it to someone else, and they go, oh, no, this doesn't work at all, and it's for the strangest reasons. A lot of it is down to kind of personal perception of the situation. The most benign things can be a huge problem to people. I've got a few examples here, so bear with me. There's a game called it's in the PlayStation VR Worlds collection, and it's the shark tank. So you're in this big cage, and you're going down into the depth, and you see this big shark flying around. It's a great narrative experience where you just sit back and watch it all happen around you. It's really, really immersive. Yeah. It's very, very, very intimate, and there's lots of going around the environment, a lot of detail, and it's done very well. And if someone hasn't played VR, more often than not, that's one of the things I'll get them to play. One of the things I ask before we do that is, are you scared of sharks? Because it's like there's a shark there, and obviously it's a very intense experience for someone who would be scared of sharks to be very close. And people go, no, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. And I go, okay, and they go in. One time, I got someone into VR, scared of sharks? No, you're going to love this. They put on the headset, they're playing, 2-3 minutes in, they just start screaming, ah! Pull off the headset and throw it on the ground. I'm like, what? And they go, you didn't say there would be jellyfish. So you can go to the ends of the earth to make this right, but yeah, there's so many little things in there that can cause these reactions. Tumble Vr is another great example. So I have a friend who, he kind of enjoys VR, but is not really the thing he plays a lot with. And again, I had an evening where I got him to play all these games. And he sat down to play Tumble Vr. Now, for those who don't know, Tumble Vr is this, sci-fi styled puzzle game where you're in this huge chamber and you're just floating there. You don't have a body, you just have controls. And you manipulate these cubes and you stack them up. I thought, oh, this will be great. No camera movement, it's a nice, easy thing. You've just done the shark experience, that was fine. It wasn't the jellyfish person. And he sat down, got the headset on, the level started, he looked down and he went, and again, tore the headset off completely. He was like, and I just couldn't understand what happened. I was like, you just started the level. What just happened? He's like, there was no seat under me. I was going to fall. I'm like, oh, and he's the only person I know who've ever played that game and looked down and just seen a death drop and assumed that they would fall, where everyone else is just focused on the thing in front of them. And, I still don't know the difference between who's going to do that and who's not. And it's just such a personal thing. It's fascinating to see and to see how people react to these things. Someone else was on, again, PlayStation Worlds. It sounds like I'm selling the game, so if I haven't already, go buy PlayStation Worlds and VR from the Sony London studio. But it's on the front end of the menu of the game. You're in this big, chambered room with pillars and everything, and each game's got its own area, and you're facing. Each one you select brings up a different sphere in front of you. Now, if you select the shark dive, there's a big water sphere, and you put your head inside it, and your sound goes blah, 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 blah. It's great, and you make a little noise, and bubbles come out. It's wonderful. If you go to the luge game, there's a spinning tarmac-style ball that spins really, really fast, and you can put the controller on it, and sparks fly off it, and it feels incredible. And then there's this game called Danger Ball, which is about, reflecting balls back with this kind of laser thing, and it's all very Tron and futuristic styled. And the ball is this kind of floaty VR beach ball thing. So, again, a friend of mine, she sat there, watching this thing, going, oh, this is incredible. We've been through a few games. I asked her to try this. She knocks the ball forward, and it goes, whoom. She goes, ha, bats it, and it goes, whoom. She goes, ha, ha, boom, and it goes, shoo. And she dives off the chair to get away from the ball. And I was like, I just left you in the menus. So it's just incredible to see people's reaction. Again, the brain telling you things that aren't there and reacting to that. So really figuring out what your design intent is and comparing that to the end user and how they're going to feel it. And one of the easiest ways to do this, again, obviously, is to test the game as much as possible and get as many people into it, playing it as much as possible. It's worth noting that over time, like anything, you tend to get used to things. I'm lucky enough to never have felt motion sickness in anything I've played, so I can just throw stuff on. But that's actually quite limiting to me as a designer, because it means I'm not quite able to tell what things will make people ill and what won't. I've got a much better idea as I've gone on, and I've tested it on a lot of people, but right at the beginning, it was unable for me to tell. Designers can completely lose the ability of gut feel here. So if you're a game designer who's used to building a lot of mechanics and just knowing that's the right thing, all of a sudden you've got that instinct taken away from you. And it's entirely about testing your assumptions on audiences and making them understand. Camera rules, this is a great one as well. There's a kind of different set of things. Like one of the things they said is don't ever tilt the camera. But one of the things we found was I think one of my favorite experiences still is there's a launch tube sequence in Eve Valkyrie. And you're sat in a kind of Battlestar Galactica style spaceship in this launch tube, and it builds up, and the lights go choop, 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 and you're like, oh, here I go, and it goes woo, boom, and you shoot off down the tunnel. And you watch people play it, and everyone who does it leans back in their seat because they're traveling so fast. And it's a really subtle trick they do, which is at the point the game goes, they tilt the camera just a bit, and that makes you as a player go, oh, and then they settle it off, and it's one of the smartest things I've seen. I was like, so good. So I'm always so impressed by little things like that, where they've just broken a rule just slightly to give the intent, and that's worked really well. However, cameras are a strange thing in this aspect. So I was talking to a colleague, and we were talking about, we've got like a city landscape, for example. We're looking at this city, and we're like, okay, we want to have a top-down camera. I was like, well, you can't. It's VR. He's like, yeah, you can have a top-down camera. Like, you can't have a top-down camera. And he's like, no, you just grab the camera and tilt it so it looks down. However, if you're in VR and you grab the camera and tilt it down, the world does that. So it's no longer looking down on the city, the whole city's done that. So you're staring at buildings in front of you, and nothing makes sense anymore. So changing the camera perspective and tilt is a huge deal. So you can only generally have a camera that is oriented where the player's looking. So a top-down camera becomes, the city's physically below me, and I have to look down to see it. Which means if you're designing a game that involves a top-down camera to show a map or a city, what do you do with your body? Do you have no body? Is my friend who's going to freak out, think he's going to fall because he's floating above a city? There's all these different things that in video games before you could have done, stick in a top-down camera, put it on a map, and all of a sudden they become really, really difficult to do. Wipeout VR has some incredible things it does with the way the track moves, and they tend to tie the camera to the lean and the angle of the track, so that as you're moving around, the world kind of stays with you. They've put a lot of options inside that game so that you're able to adjust to the way that you want to play it as a player. Now, Wipeout VR, I think, is also, the moment, the one for me that's been the most eye-opening to see the results of all this years of testing in VR. If you look at all the major VR games that are out there at the moment, you'll see that a lot of them have huge amounts of options for comfort. Because when you're starting to play in VR, obviously, if you're new to VR, you want to have an easier experience to ease yourself into it. If you're a hardcore veteran at VR and you get no motion sickness, you don't want to be hampered by limited movement speed and turns. You want the full-on Twitch experience where you can have absolutely everything unlocked. But if you have a look at the way Wipeout VR has presented their options, they have several little things that don't seem like they would make that much difference, but make all the difference. And one of the things they've done is change the size of the cockpit, where the cockpit starts off like that, or you remove a panel and it gets a bit further back, and remove it and it gets a bit further back. And all of that is designed to eliminate pixel travel, because all the information going past your brain telling you you're speeding is the stuff that your brain's struggling to cope with and giving you that odd feel. The other thing they do, again, is tying it to the camera and changing the feeling of acceleration. They also have an option which detaches your head from, not in real life. It detaches your game camera from the inside of the cockpit, so that as the cockpit moves, you don't, whereas one of it feels fixed. And then again, that is removing a point of reference to tell your brain what is physically going on in the world compared to what you're used to in real life. Someone asked me about, why is there this feeling of sickness? And it's all down to the fact of your brain thinking it's receiving different information from what you're seeing. And I'm not really an expert on this, but apparently it's the same as being drunk, where, that cut out there, it's the same as being drunk, where your body believes, because there's disconnect of swarming and everything, and your vision's slightly weird and your balance is off, your brain goes, uh-oh, I've been poisoned, pulls the cord and you throw up. And it's very, very similar in VR. Your brain starts getting conflicting information and goes, hold on, something's wrong here. Oh, we've been poisoned. And that's what your body is reacting to. I've never drunk in my life, so I can't actually confirm this, but a lot of friends tell me that is the case. So, What we've learned with all of these rules, we've got rules that have been established for body, for movement, for cameras, for motion, for the environment, for drama, stage setting, pace, and everything. But the absolute truth of it is, you need to figure out the rules that are going to work best for the games that you're making. Because the more, it's going to be down to, I don't think it's even going to be my generation, it's going to be people in this room who are going to go on and make these discoveries and create those periodic tables of game designs for VR. We're going to establish standards that work for different types of games, and people are going to accept those and move with them. For me, the most incredible experiences I find in VR are the more surreal ones. I really like things like, I just forgot the name of it. I mentioned it earlier, the one on the track, Thumper. Thank you, sir. Sorry about all that staring earlier. Thumper is just incredible. It's just, there's no body, you're looking at this floating thing, and because of the rules they've constructed around it, it works really, really well. Exactly the same for Tumble Vr. They created their own rule set on that team at Supermassive, and they just thought exactly about what the environment needs, how the UI has to feel, how the controllers need to look, what your depth of field is, what movement is working. It's exactly the same story for Rush of Blood as well. It's the roller coaster through the mind. It's a horror experience. It's what you can push and get away with, and what the player will need to be introduced with. I think the fascinating thing at the beginning of Rush of Blood, for those who haven't played it, you start off already moving. The title screen is moving down a slow-moving roller coaster with stuff happening left and right of you, and there's jump scares, and it tells you exactly what you need to know about the game, so the game's not putting you on edge when you get in. So a lot of this all comes down to figuring out the design of your game, the direction you want to give it, and then creating the rules or experimenting with the rules that sort that. And again, that's going to be all you guys and how you deal with that. So define the rules that are best for your game and feel right for the world that you're creating, and everyone else will have to catch up. Now, I'm going to end here on a strong one, which is a quote I read the other day from, of all people, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who said, "Sometimes I wonder whether virtual reality has gotten so good that we've lost all urge to invent the actual reality that it imitates." And I just say to that you guys have the power to create things that nobody could create ever, especially in virtual reality, and we can get even closer to those experiences. So I urge you all to go out and just raise the bar creatively and just make things that just no one could ever dream of except you, and do a good job with it. Thank you. I think I have time for questions. I do? All right. Let's do questions. Okay, do I pick, or do you guys?
Hey, have you ever had any experiences with social VR, like social VR games?
Social VR games?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So online experiences with VR. Yeah, yes, I have. It's there's several out there. They're all of varying degrees of quality and interaction. It's a weird one. I don't think we've learned to behave as humans correctly in regular online games, let alone VR games. So it's an interesting space to be in, let's say. It's a lot of the things you have to figure out are suddenly in the player's hands, how they behave, how close they get to each other, their physical movement. So considering all that in your design is a huge, huge part of those worlds, and I think we've still got a fair way to go for that, but there are some really good experiences in that. Like there's the Facebook VR app at the moment, and there's some really great stuff in that, and I know on Oculus Gear VR, there's some great stuff in there you can have a look at as well, but that's more, again, on, like you said, on the social side of things, away from physical worlds and gaming, where you can do whatever you like. This way, Mike Minion.
So did you ever solve the whole, Tumble VR looking down? Oh my god, it's a deathfall. Like, how did you solve that?
How did I solve that?
Yeah.
I told him not to freak out.
Okay.
No, he was actually okay. It's again, for me, a huge part of it is about the disconnect between what a player is going to expect and what they actually get involved with. VR is a very difficult format to actually, sell and explain to people, because I can stand here and tell you guys exactly how incredible it is, and like, you wouldn't believe how amazing it is, and they're like, yeah, cool. It's only when they put on a headset that they can actually experience it and go, oh, I can see exactly what you mean. And even in this room, getting a headset for everybody here and showing you what it's like is a big task that takes a lot of time. So when people haven't got that experience and they go in thinking one thing and then get something else, that's where the disconnect occurs, and that can make it even more uncomfortable for them. So for me, yeah, a lot of it is making it clear what you're going into, what it's going to be. I have a rule where, on my teams as well, where nobody messes with anyone who's in a headset. Like no one touches you or moves you out of the way or anything, because it would just remove you from the experience, and it's a really dangerous thing. And you want to feel like you are completely in the environment that you're in. You want to escape into this other reality that you're creating. So the idea that each time you put it on, your friends might fuck with you, you're like, that it's important to kind of get rid of that. So understanding what you're going into and everything is the kind of key to that part of it. Oh, sorry, he's not even listening.
Hi. How do you feel about the peripherals like wheels and custom controllers?
Peripherals so wheels and custom controllers, they can be really powerful, because if you can get 100% parity between the things you're feeling and the things you're seeing in the world feels much more real. We had a great moment at Supermassive, where our audio director was playing Batman VR, and he was just looking at all the things they were doing, and on a lunch break playing a bunch of other games. And he moved the PlayStation VR controller and went to touch a panel, and someone was standing next to him, and it went boom on the guy's arm, and the guy in the headset was like, how does it do it? And so just the fact that there was a little bit of reaction in there gave him so much more depth in his experience. So yeah, if you've got wheels and things like that, that can be a real big enhancement. I think when you've got things like the huge treadmills you have to run, and the things that take into consideration your body, again, you very quickly bump up against how long you're designing those sessions for. Because, I play basketball, so I can do, 40 minutes on the court and reverse dunks and stuff, but I can't do that in a video game, especially not with wires all over the place in my front room. So figuring out the space for that stuff and what peripherals suited for it, yeah, absolutely. This guy.
Do you think that...
Wait, where am I looking? Aha! It's a very bright light, I'm sorry.
Do you think that VR will be the future of video games, and basically where all video games are moving towards?
Will VR be the future of video games? Okay, I'll answer this one carefully, because it's a difficult thing and might get me hung. But I describe myself as someone who's passionate about VR. I don't describe myself as a VR enthusiast, because I've met a lot of VR enthusiasts who say VR is going to be the next big thing, and PlayStation games aren't going to be a thing anymore, and no one's going to play their mobile, and we're going to be walking down the street with headsets on, high-fiving each other virtually. I don't think that's going to happen yet. Because there's a huge thing about putting something on your face. That's a big part of it. And not everybody's comfortable with that. That's a truth we have to face. There's some people who have dreadlocks, some ladies wear makeup, some guys wear makeup, some people have glasses, some people have turbans. There's a lot that goes on the human head, and not many people are comfortable with just accepting that. I run a very tight, disciplined headset discipline, with sprays and wipes and everything, because hygiene, that's the word. It's important that someone's absolutely comfortable to pick something up and put it on. And if someone's been working on it for, a week or so, and they've just sat there with this thing on their head all day, and they just hand it to you, it's a bit like, someone else hands you their headphones. Your first thing isn't, I want to rub those all over my ears. It's like, there we go. And yeah, it's very much the same sort of thing there. So there's several limiting factors. One is the amount of space you require, the amount of wires involved, the technical knowledge needing to do it. For me, still the best experience is PlayStation VR, because it's the least amount of cables, the right amount of money. You've got a console, you can just set it up and play in. You don't need that much space. It's seated experiences as well as standing, and it's very accessible. For the moment, that one's the best for me. But it'll be interesting to see where the tech goes. I think the tech's got a while to catch up before. Ultimately, as soon as we hit Star Trek holodecks, that's where it's going to be. But I don't know how far that is. Leaning on the invisible counter. One more? What are we doing for time? Cool. One more.
Hi.
Hey, we got there.
I have about VR being so immersive. It's often called the empathy machine. Do you ever get worried about that? So in a sense, in the same way that movies and television shows make us insensitive to violence because we get so exposed to it
Okay.
and stuff like that. So do you ever think about like maybe VR can have some negative consequences because we get so immersed into and we get maybe numb to empathy and the experiences that we get through VR.
So I guess it's like anything. It's that idea of, you know, when books came along, it was just like, oh, your books are really powerful things because they make you feel things. Same about music. You know, people tried to ban rock and roll. You introduce video games and it's a new thing. People were asking the same stuff about video games when they first came along, and now we've got something that's, you know, even more powerful where you feel like you're physically in the space where these things are happening. And a lot of that is a kind of a balance issue where the type of content created for it obviously needs some kind of restriction, and you know, no one's going to go and make a crazy murder simulator and release it and everyone just go, wow, that's too much, because that will naturally police itself. And on the other side, people get used to the experience and know, this isn't real. Because you just do. The more you play it, the more you adjust to it, and the more your brain understands that the thing you're seeing isn't a real thing. I think for me, the interesting side of that is because it's so powerful and it is this thing that can introduce empathy, we can use it to educate more. You can put people in situations where they do learn from it and they do consider their feelings on things. And that's the wrong thing to say. I'm sorry. Yeah, you do consider, you know, how you're putting that player in that situation a bit more. So developers tend to think a lot more about the situations they put players in, I think, and I think that's a good thing actually. So I think that's it. Is that right? Or have I've got no time. Cool. They turned off your mic as well.
Yes. Wonderful. Now, isn't there still a bit of a difficulty to kind of make ends meet and to find the market for games in VR? Because the equipment needed to play this is still quite expensive.
I'd turn that question back on you and just say that applies to all video games. I mean, it's echoing some of the stuff Raf was saying earlier on about making video games is not the way. You're not going to get rich by making video games. You do it for the love of the craft and the thing you're building. You know, it's the equivalent of being in a band. It really is. It's like it's an artistic thing that you make and you concentrate on. If you're going to make something for VR, it's your responsibility as a developer to figure out a way that is going to make money. I mean, I wouldn't just say go and make something, spend all your money on it, and you know you're going to get rich. You always have to consider the business angle of it. So considering the size of your audience, you know, considering whether your game is solely VR or you can put it on other platforms as well. If you can make a game that, you know, is this big VR content, but actually you can also play it on a regular game, that then widens your audience. There's lots and lots of things you can do. Even if you made a purely VR game that was on Oculus Vive and PlayStation VR, you've got a good chance at making your money back if you're keeping your costs low and if you make something really, really good. And that's on you. I think I keep saying one more, but here we go.
Yeah, if you could add one feature to the current generation of VR hardware, what would it be? What do you feel is currently missing as a experienced designer?
Well, I've said it for many months. If VR needs anything, it's more wires. I don't know, honestly, there's so much new tech coming along with AR and MR and you know tactile things and the force feedback on the fingers and stuff that I'm just excited as a developer to just see what comes along and think about how I'd use that. So I'm not inventing any tech yet, no. And I think we'll call it a day on that. So thank you very much, everyone.